Tēnā, nau mai, haere mai, ki te Aotearoa New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre, ko Vivian Hunt ho, ka nui te mihi nui kia koutou katoa. My name is Vivian Hunt, and as the host for the New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for our Spotlight on Food Safety Science seminar. Today we have speakers from Plant and Food Research, Dr. Denise Conroy and Dr. Jenny Young, who will speak about their research with retailers and consumers on the use of X-ray as a phytosanitary treatment for fruit and vegetables as an alternative to methyl bromide fumigation. Before I get Denise to start, I will just give a brief introduction. Denise Conroy, some of you will know, is a senior scientist and team leader of Stakeholder and Consumer Intelligence at Plant and Food in Auckland. She's a research psychologist and has specialized in understanding the attitudes, emotions, and values that motivate people to consume specific products, brands, or reject those offerings. As an interpretive researcher, she works largely with qualitative methods and data, and she leads interdisciplinary teams with much of her work being Asia focused. As the Consumer Insights Principal Investigator for the Higher Value Nutrition National Science Challenge, Denise's team are working on understanding how both Chinese and consumers in New Zealand make decisions relating to food and health. After working for 20 years at the University of Auckland in the business school, Denise joined Plant and Food in 2019 to do more applied research, and in particular to support New Zealand SMEs use consumer insights to develop their businesses. Dr. Jenny Young is a consumer behaviour researcher who's specialising in food decision making. Following a background in industry and marketing in the FMCG, she attained her PhD from the University of Auckland and spent 5 years lecturing in the Department of Marketing. She's currently a visiting researcher in the Stakeholder and Consumer Intelligence team at Plant and Food Research Institute, where she's specialising in obtaining qualitative insights about how people obtain meaning about food consumption, new technologies, and potential new crops. Her research includes exploring how consumers and stakeholders adapt in marketplaces, which are often characterized by having conflicting and changing information. Such research is helping inform strategic decisions about key issues such as food supply and food sustainability, which is becoming more important in both our domestic and export markets. So I'll just remind you to put your questions into the Q&A, and I'll hand over now to Denise and Jenny, and thank you both of you for presenting today. So Denise, if you'd like to do a few introductory remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Vivian. Hi, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for coming today. So I'm going to just set the scene, and then Jenny's going to be taking over. So we're going to be, as Vivian said, talking to you today about X-ray as a phytosanitary treatment. And rather than coming from a science angle, we're really looking at the perspective of stakeholders and consumers. So get the next slide, please, Jenny. Thank you. So it's really important that we understand social and cultural acceptance of new technologies. We know historically that new technologies are often faced with rejection, at least by the end consumer, until they understand the benefits. So people who are as old as I am, you can perhaps remember back to when cell phones first came on the scene, and people were really concerned about them and about the towers. And then as the benefits began to really outweigh those concerns, we had such wide adoption that I'm pretty sure all of us now have at least one, if not more. So in order to mitigate that hesitancy or rejection, which of course can be very expensive for an organisation, it's really important that the positioning is done correctly. And in order to do that, it's really necessary to understand what the potential barriers are, and also what the benefits are considered to be the best by consumers. So the only way of doing that is by talking to them, of course, and that's where we come in. Next one, Jenny. So New Zealand, of course, has to protect its borders from incursion and pest incursion, as do our exporters and export markets. So it's really necessary that we have phytosanitary treatments. At the moment, the most widely adopted is methyl bromide, but we know that methyl bromide is incredibly damaging for the ozone layer. So many countries are looking for alternatives to be able to phase out methyl bromide. Otherwise, they need to recapture it, which is incredibly expensive. So new alternatives are being sought for different products and different produce. And one potential is X-ray treatment, and that's about food irradiation. So there are many benefits or potential benefits for X-ray treatments. So we know that it is a possibility and we know that it is safe, but is it going to be socially and culturally accepted? Next slide. Thanks, Jenny. So although it has been proven to be safe for a very long time, in terms of penetration for the market, it's been incredibly slow. And that has largely been driven by the fact that consumers on a global stage are not very accepting. And that lack of acceptance seems to be because they don't really understand. And they go very quickly from irradiation to radiation to nuclear. And that's just a no for most people. So our question was really whether the time is now ripe. Is it now time to actually say, okay, let's look at this again and let's see what we can do with respect to positioning that may make this more acceptable as a phytosanitary treatment than it has been held to be in the past. So I'll hand you back to Jenny now, and Jenny is going to talk you through the actual research that we did. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, Denise, and kia ora koutou, a warm welcome to you all. Yes, it was a really great project for us in that it involved understanding some of the conflicts that people face in quite an emotionally driven area. So I'm going to present two studies today. Firstly, I'll start with the qualitative in-depth interviews that we did with retailers, and then move and take you through some of the results that we did in the survey. Both of these studies were done last year. So starting with our retailers. So we know really retailers are, of course, gatekeepers for consumers, and we wanted to understand if there were any potential barriers in the supply chain. So our objectives were really to understand, firstly, what levels of awareness there are about existing methods of phytosanitation, and what might influence retailers' views about selling X-ray treated foods to their consumers. And also, we wanted to raise this issue of the replacement of a methyl bromide chemical fumigation with a different type of treatment. And as part of the research, although we did 12 interviews, we wanted to understand differences between different types of retailers and personnel regarding these perceptions. So the method was, as I said, in-depth interviews, and these were all conducted over Zoom. We had a recruitment agency who were able to give us a great range of retailers, from those in quite senior positions in supermarket chains, and we also brought in the food kit delivery companies, organic fruit and vegetable suppliers as well. And so to try to sort of encapsulate a good range. So the interviews lasted about 45 minutes, and it was really good to hear feedback from the recruitment agency that the stakeholders that we interviewed were very engaged in the topic, and some of them actually offered to speak to us again in other interviews. So once we had the interviews, they were transcribed, and then we did a thematic analysis of them to understand the sort of central themes and look for those differences. I won't go into details here, but this is really just an overview. We used, those are pseudonyms of the people so that we can't identify any of them. They were anonymous in the interviews, but we broke them down really by the type of business, their level that they were in the business, and how their type of buying style. But there was also, we identified different age groups as well in terms of understanding their opinions. So overviewing the key areas, first of all, we found really that in general, this whole sphere of biosecurity treatment, it was seen as being a necessary part of their business, but it wasn't something that they often really wanted to talk about. I've got a couple of quotes there. You know, I'm aware of the treatments, but I don't really want to talk about them. Some of them are not very nice, to be fair. And so there was this sort of impression that it's going to be taking place. But what we did have confirmed was that there was real trust in the New Zealand regulation system, which was good to hear. And so that they even though they weren't necessarily wanting to talk about it, there was this underlying feeling that what was being done was necessary, but that it would be well conducted. In terms of understanding different methods, we had a total range of views from those who had quite a lot of knowledge. Those in more senior position had quite a lot of knowledge about the different methods and what went on, to some who were working in retail areas and perhaps less senior positions who didn't really understand any of the processes that were happening. The idea of fumigation that was happening was more widely known, but when it came to understanding food irradiation, there was some knowledge, but when we specifically talked about X-ray as a treatment, that was very low in terms of familiarity and understanding. So we, in the interview, we introduced X-ray and we discussed it as being a method that's available. It's a type of food irradiation and being considered. So there was this tendency, of course, as Denise mentioned, to immediately link this word irradiation, X-ray, with these more, I guess, emotionally driven words like toxic, nuked, being zapped. It sort of resonated is not obviously a positive type of a word. Here's a couple of quotes that they clearly linked it to the medical application. I mean, everyone's been for an X-ray, presumably talking about the dentist. You know, they put you on their protective gear and they rush out of the room and leave you sitting there. So in terms of food safety, perhaps you're going to associate that experience, I guess. So, but then on the other hand, we see something completely different, that it's seen in a positive light. This is by a younger retailer, and he's saying that this is actually positive, because if there are certain benefits of extra shelf life, that he could definitely understand that there were benefits and didn't immediately kind of swing to the more emotional impressions. We then framed the X-ray treatment as a potential alternative to methyl bromide, and finding that none of the retailers that we interviewed knew anything about the plans to phase methyl bromide out, but they certainly, when they were told about these issues with ozone depletion, that X-ray was definitely seen in a much more favourable light. And this was especially for those companies where they had almost a sort of an image of their company being seen as being more modern, more socially sustainable. And this came through again with the younger participants. So, and they could see that there was a link with the values of their customers, and that this could be seen in a much more positive light. But definitely the feeling about methyl bromide fumigation was very negative, really, because of the chemical connotations. And this was seen in light of what they thought the customers would think, as well as their own personal views. just a couple of quotes as well from those younger stakeholders who are much more enthusiastic in seeing this understanding that, yes, X-ray treatment could be seen in a much more positive light because of this idea that we want to be doing more positive and better for our environment, and that I think the product will be perceived better because it's just X-ray treated. And it's a way of saying we're more modern and we're leading countries, becoming in line with other countries rather than stuck back in the 1980s fumigating things. So in summary, really across the retailers, we saw that four of them were definitely in favour of introducing X-ray treated products into their stores. And these ones could see the logistical benefits for the retailer and seeing it in the slide as a modern treatment. 6 were open to the concept, but definitely stated the need for education and information to be able to commit more to it. And they wanted, I guess, a greater transparency about it. And there were 2 who were opposed and said they would not stop any produce that had been X-ray treated in their stores. So these were one was an organic supplier, and the other was more a younger junior buyer who had, concerns about personal health as well. So the kind of reasons for this perhaps hesitancy from some of those in the middle there were that they couldn't quite understand how they would expect their customers to potentially have misunderstandings and negative reaction because of a lack of information, because it is quite a difficult narrative, I guess, to be conveying to consumers. So they felt they would perhaps consumers would just see this term and react to it quite negatively, and that this would be due to them making associations, particularly with illnesses, and not being sure about the sort of consequences of having X-ray treatment being in the food supply. And several of the retailers alluded to this kind of romantic ideal that they have, I guess, have also wanted to promote, of being that fresh produce has come really from the field. It's picked by a farmer and beautifully presented in a basket, and it's lovely and fresh. And so there's this positive halo that surrounds the sector and is very positive for the sector, and that perhaps conflicts with the idea of having to do these types of treatments. And if people knew everything that goes on, the length of time that a product sits on a boat, it's because it's a complicated business. I guess it's this feeling that if these issues are raised, it's going to destroy that kind of romantic thing of people in their heads like to think fruit's picked up a tree by a happy smiling person and put in a basket. So that was this kind of, I guess, feeling from some of the larger supermarket chains that there would be a lack of understanding. So in terms of how the retailers saw their role, for some particularly the traditional retailers, they did foresee a difficulty in education, and they felt that it was best to just go on as normal and perhaps only educate if needed, and that you wouldn't want to almost raise this as an issue. You have to be careful in case there is a negative connotation, and what you say could almost affect the produce sector. And they certainly had felt that they had good relationships with growers, and they didn't really want to feel that they might affect local supply in some way, even indirectly. And on the other hand, there were those that thought transparency, that their types of customers and coming into their retail stores or in the food kit market, they felt that their customers would understand this, that they would in fact understand these types of issues and would be able to self-inform themselves, so that if they can give customers information about it, this narrative would actually be quite positive. And so that in this way, by being able to arm their customers with information, it was seen in a positive light. So rather than covering it up, we're actually putting it out there as a much more positive narrative, and a way of saying, you know, our customers are actually, you know, wanting to learn this type of information. And at the final end were the two who really did not want to stop them at all, and would not offer them, and wouldn't be interested in any way, shape or form. So I guess overall across what we gained really from our initial retailer study was that there is certainly a great range of views, and this has been nuanced by the level of seniority and how much background knowledge there is, but also the company philosophy. But what they did tell us was they didn't really foresee a major negative protest reaction coming through, as we would have seen back, of those of you who remember the early 2000s with issues around GM. They didn't foresee perhaps that level of kind of protest, but it was really important that if there is transparency in labelling, so that if they are comfortable that their produce is being labelled correctly in their processes, then it's going to be, they feel, I guess, that their role is going to be able to put the produce out there, but know that there is transparency for them. But definitely more education. They wanted to learn more about it so they could feel more comfortable. But I think the good thing across all the interviews was that there was a very strong trust held in the New Zealand systems and MPI, and that these would test for safe processes, so that they felt a great confidence in the system. Okay, so, and we're very happy to answer questions at the end of this on both the studies, but I'll move on now to talk about, so we've heard about what the retailers think the customers might say, but now let's move into what we did hear from the customers in our survey. So our aims here were to quantify and to understand some of the initial attitudes, and which we firstly started with looking at food irradiation as a general topic, and then we moved into understanding attitudes about X-ray specifically, and then X-ray in combination, in comparison to methyl bromide fumigation. We wanted to see, I guess, if there were any different consumer segments and ways of understanding how consumers would feel about this whole sphere. So we conducted an online survey with the questionnaire was informed by some previous literature and focus groups that we had done, and we used a existing consumer panel with we had over 1,000 respondents, and so with quotas based on gender, age, ethnicity and location in New Zealand. So the average completion time for the survey was about 10 minutes. So it was there was a series of questions. We started with asking to give some context, I guess, and to get some sort of relativity. We included a question about how willing would you be to eat fruit and vegetables, and they're treated with each of these different technologies, and these were rotated. So as you can see there, when we're looking at the addition of preservatives, the more green you've got at the top there, they would definitely feel comfortable eating them, versus right down to the lower or the red, where I would definitely never eat them. So you can see there that in a way very similar kind of results across for genetic modification, food irradiation and chemical fumigation. And interestingly, we see genetic modification, in comparison, it's a little difficult to compare across different studies, but earlier studies would have shown genetic modification to be a lot higher actually into the red zones. But it seems that food irradiation has stayed fairly constant. We've got some people quite strongly negative at the bottom, and then those more positive, a little bit more open towards the top. So it's I guess in the middle, there's that uncertain band. Okay, so we then moved on and asked specifically about X-ray treatment, and we put the statement appeared on the screen, that X-ray treatment is used in some countries to kill pests which may be on fruit and vegetables when they are to be exported. So it was a fairly generic concept that we asked about. And the results we see were that, once again, we've got that, I guess, polarized sort of viewpoint where some down would never want to eat them versus some 20%, 20% in the more positive, having a more positive view. And what we did, we looked at I'll put on now the reasons. And so this is for the reasons for being not willing and to eat the produce that had been treated with X-ray. So it was really about, it seemed to be more about the fact that it was, there wasn't enough information. They were unsure, but definitely you can see those reasons that we had, and Denise talked about as well, the danger, safety concerns, being harmful, seeing X-rays dangerous in large doses, what would happen, you know, what are the effects going to be on the food? It doesn't sound right. It's very much a health and emotional concerns about health. But then on the other side, those who indicated that they were a little bit more positive or actually really feeling quite comfortable about eating fruit and vegetables that have been X-ray treated, their rationale was more that they felt it was safe, didn't seem harmful, and they didn't believe that the X-rays would stay in the food. So it was going to be a sort of it wouldn't be used if it wasn't safe. So there is a lot of trust coming through there, and the regulations, and the fact that they rationalise that people are X-rayed without ill effects. So they would, yes, I'd like more information, but generally a lot more comfortable. And also that idea that chemical residue is seen in a very negative way, so that X-ray treatment is going to be, you know, a lot more acceptable for these groups. We then introduced the concept of methyl bromide as in this states here. So currently, methyl bromide is used as a fumigant to kill pests on some fruit and vegetables exported from New Zealand, as well as some imports entering New Zealand. And so we also gave this rationale about methyl bromide being environmentally damaging because of its possible depletion of the ozone layer and the replacement. And we put the proviso on that we're looking for initial impressions, and we realise, of course, that for a lot of people, this is the very first time that they will have seen this type of information. So we're really here just tapping for initial impressions. So when there was a forced choice, and if you had to choose fruit and vegetables that have been treated with one of these technologies, which ones are you most likely to choose? You can see there very clearly virtually, well, 84% were favouring and pushed the X-ray treatment button, and the others methyl bromide. So it was for those, particularly in the over 65-year-old category, it went up to actually virtually 9 out of 10 people who were in favour of X-ray treatment. Well, but this was, you had to answer this question to move on, so it was a forced choice. But I think a very clear result there when you see them in comparison. So once again, looking at the reasons, so for those who did actually select, for the 16% who did select that they felt they wanted to choose methyl bromide, that once again, it was because of the unknown effects of X-rays, and where they felt, say, something had been chemically treated, it could actually be washed off, whereas radiation was perhaps an unknown object that might be within the food. So they're, I think, clearly really, I think the fair result perhaps had been coming through for this group. But on the other side of it, for those who chose X-ray treatment, it was the absence of chemicals that was clearly the strongest reason for actually noting why you would have chosen when you had to make this forced choice. So sounds safer, sounds better, but it's very much, I guess, a way of what is the lesser of the two evils. If you've got to have one or the other, you'll go towards the X-ray treatment. I'd also included this slide just to show that we had a series of statements, and the respondents were asked to choose which of they had X-ray treatment or methyl bromide on the screen, and also a don't know, and they had to choose specifically which one would best fit. So it would say, for example, looking in the middle there, which is safer for my personal health? And you can see their X-ray treatment, 50% of people had agreed that that's the safer option, and certainly not methyl bromide, but there was also still this kind of large, I don't know, really, I can't decide. But certainly they got the message about it being better for the environment, better for New Zealand's image as an exporter of fruit and vegetables, so safer for personal health. But when it came to effectiveness at killing pests on fruit and vegetables, perhaps again, they really just didn't have the information and couldn't make the choice. But I think interesting, what would have the most effect on taste? Certainly the methyl bromide seeing as affecting taste more, and not the X-ray treatment wasn't chosen there. So really, just sort of in conclusion, that this type of what we saw in the results here really fits, I think, in with a lot of the work on what we do with food technologies and about what is considered to be natural. And we do see segments where there are what we call the back to nature seekers, and those that are seeking organic produce. They're what we would call label readers. They're very concerned with what they're eating and concerned with the way food affects their health. So that segment are those that are more likely to have concerns about X-ray treatment. In the middle, you've got a large segment of the price conscious who are just there seeking bargains, want good quality, shopping, really driven more and more by price, but also wanting acceptable quality and having trust in the supply chain, and probably not really wanting to perhaps be informed or know about these types of issues necessarily. And then on the other side, the pragmatists who like food innovation and they want to have modern solutions. And so they're going to be far more accepting of these types of treatments. So I think overall though, trust in the New Zealand supply chain, and a particular reason I guess why that people will shop in the mainstream quite happily. So overall, I think from both the studies, what we've seen that it is going to be a kind of a complex narrative to be able to educate retailers and consumers, but certainly in terms of X-ray treatment, the sustainability advantages are clear there. But with education, there'll be a need for it to come from a range of independent sources. I think it's many of the younger consumers, males, those with higher education, will self-inform and also evaluate views from social media. But there is a sort of, I think coming from the retailers, there is this need for how much information should you really need to share, so because we don't want negative effects. Some pointed out that perhaps the name of X-ray, if we could perhaps potentially use a different name, not talk about irradiation, not talk about X-ray, but I don't think that is actually a possibility, but that was just one suggestion. But overall message, I think, is transparency is important and labelling must be clearly displayed. So I think when we progress into our future research and we're looking at ways of perhaps being able to disseminate this type of story so that we have a much more favourable outcome for everyone. So I'll hand over now to questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jenny. We do have a couple of questions. That's great. So the first question is from Angela Park, who are asking about, are we talking about irradiation methods using X-ray exclusively and not considering gamma or electron methods? Which is the most common type of ionizing radiation that's used in the irradiation process? I don't know if you can answer that.
I think that when you're talking to consumers and stakeholders about things that you know they won't have a great deal of knowledge about anyway, it's just that we keep things really, really conservative. So we don't differentiate in those ways. If we were talking to stakeholders who are in the business of irradiation, then we would. But we really just use very generic terms.
So irradiation had a big, how much of a bad rap did, that was used in the early days? How much has that impacted on attitudes, do you think?
I think that what's happening here is that people don't understand or don't know about fumigation anyway. So you've got methyl bromide going on, but people don't know that. So when you start talking about X-ray, they think that you're introducing something, not replacing something. But once you explain that there is methyl bromide, which is a chemical, or there's X-ray, which obviously isn't a chemical, then they start to be less emotive about the introduction, because it's actually something that has to go on. All New Zealanders that we've spoken to have been very, very positive about protecting borders and understanding that other countries need to protect their borders as well. So it's just that they haven't thought beyond that as to how that happens, and that there is a need for phytosanitary treatment.
Yeah, I understand. Another question we have is from Heather Haynes. Do you think information can ever overcome the emotion in this space?
Yes. I mean, Jenny may have other ideas. I think it can, but we're marketers, so we think we can do anything. And I think that it is that, this is why we do this kind of work. We need to know what, and we would do much deeper work if we were trying to do this in a real situation. But we need to know why people would reject and what the emotions are actually based on. And as I say, we've seen this with technologies time and time again throughout the ages. So once people understand the benefits to them, then they become much more accepting.
Yeah, I see that when your survey talked about the environmental benefits, and that was a big part of the responses, wasn't it? And they were more positive.
Yes, I think, no, I agree, Denise, with what you're saying there. But I think it's also, it comes down to a personal, when someone's thinking about their personal health, it's a very different story than when they're thinking on a larger scale about societal well-being. And certainly the term irradiation does still have quite strong connotations, but I think with time, and if the benefits of X-ray can be shown in some clearly understandable way, it's got to be a good thing.
So Jody has asked via chat, thanks for the talk. Do you feel COVID has increased conformity and had a role in bolstering the high trust indicated by participants over this time frame, or is it more generally indicative of New Zealand consumers over the last 5 to 8 years?
I'll take that first, if that's okay, Jenny. I think that the work that we've done in New Zealand, but also overseas, whether it's in China or Vietnam or South Korea, New Zealand has a food safety halo. It is throughout the supply chain. So from grower till it gets to the consumer, it is seen to be a very honest system and a very safe and secure system. So, I think COVID has perhaps alerted people a bit more to some issues, but we've always been faced with the fact that there is a very, very strong food safety halo for New Zealand, both domestically and internationally.
Yes, I agree with that, yeah. What about, there's a question from Ken Glassy, there's a hypocrisy of the system expecting irradiation to be labelled and methyl bromide is not. Acceptance of new treatments would therefore be easier, I guess, if you're saying it's labelled. Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
Yes, that's a very good point,
yeah.
in fact. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess that would be very sensitive to be starting to label methyl bromide. But I mean, I'm, you know, I think consumers would want to know, or certainly would want to know.
Any other questions? Oh, here's another one from Li Hong Zhu. Thanks very much. Do you see a need for communication, education of phytosanitary treatments in general? And if so, what should be the messaging and through which channel?
I guess speaking personally, yes, I think that there should be. I think people today want transparency, and I think I do understand the retailers wanting the romance and not to interfere with that, but I think that's a double-edged sword as well. And if people find out on their own, that can be a very negative experience for the retail or industry. And I think most people now want transparency and would be very keen on that. And you know, social media is just so dominant now that if a negative story gets out, it can just ruin businesses. So getting hold of the story in the first place is probably the best thing to do. And personally, I think that there is such a positive feeling towards protecting New Zealand's borders, which also leads to an understanding that other countries want their borders protected too, and that is a good way to start.
Jenny, you made a comment about younger males educated or more likely self-informed. Was that one of the findings in the research?
Yes, and also in terms of the slide I showed about the different treatments that we had preservatives, food irradiation, and GM and the methyl bromide or chemical fumigation. It was definitely, there were definitely segments there that younger males and those with higher education and more affluent were definitely in the more positive and more accepting of those new types of technologies in general. And whereas main household shoppers and women tended to be less accepting of the technologies right across the board. And then that would flow through also into ways of understanding that and informing themselves as well.
Okay. Any other questions from anyone on the in the audience? I don't think I've got any more. It was interesting to see the split with the GM and the food irradiation. So GM is still quite perceived quite negatively, isn't it? Is that an overall finding, do you think?
Well, increasingly more positively,
yeah.
But once again, it's something of a bell-shaped curve, or a slightly towards the negatively skewed bell-shaped curve, with a lot in the middle who really unsure.
Yeah, I think it's really softening, I think I would say. And, you know, we're doing some other research at the moment where we're specifically looking at GM. And I think one of the things that's in different countries, but also domestically, one of the things that is really highlighted for me is that, we've not done the analysis, this is off the top of my head, is people in New Zealand are genuinely ignorant in that we've just not been exposed to the technology. So I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean people are ignorant because we can talk to people in America who'll say, yeah, the kids go to school and they extract DNA from strawberries and they do these experiments and things. And we don't have any of that because it's just been not part of our society. So there's I think that's a really interesting area at the moment.
Absolutely. One other question I had was, at the beginning you said that there's quite a few global consumer studies on acceptance have been mainly negative about the technology. Where are those studies have been done all over the place, have they?
Yes, a lot of that research was done in the early 2000s, coming out of Europe, some South America, the USA. So, but across those studies, they definitely had this idea, irradiation didn't come out at all well. But I think with New Zealand, possibly it's once again, it's hard to compare across all these studies, but I think the figures that we saw, what we gleaned in our survey about X-ray, it was certainly it had improved and moved in a better direction than those studies that were done all over. Yeah, there were Poland, there was Italy. Yeah, so a lot of different studies, but quite often it just depended on the way the questions were asked as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so Lee Hong Zhu also had a similar question. Are there similar studies internationally? I guess she's asking sort of similar studies to the work you've been doing. Yeah.
No, there certainly was a sort of a rush of studies in around the 2000s, but since that time, there has been actually a real drop off in that type of research.
Okay. And I've got another question from John Vanderburg. He said, how would the study results be different for gamma irradiation versus use of X-ray when compared to methyl bromide?
Oh, that's an interesting, that could be a whole new study. Thanks. Thank you for that suggestion. Because I guess the name gamma, it's probably a completely different connotation than X-ray. So even though, I mean, it's still an irradiation, but it's a different process, and it's all in that association. So gamma, I'm only perhaps from the top of my head, I would say gamma might come across better. What do you think, Denise?
Yeah, I think that's a good extension for the study. Obviously we can't answer because we haven't done it, but no. Yeah, I would think the same, Jenny.
Okay. No, that's interesting. Okay. Oh, well, I think people are starting to get ready for their days and starting to drop off. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to both Jenny and Denise for presenting this really interesting topic and great research you're doing. And now you've got another subject to do, looking at gamma. So I appreciate you for taking this time and for all of you for attending. And our next seminar, which is on the 29th of April, will be with Pierre Vintner from Fonterra, and he's going to be looking at the role of applied food safety science in dynamic risk management. So hope that you can all attend that on the 29th of April. So thanks again to Denise and Jenny, and thank you all for attending.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.